Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcasts co-production recorded on a Wagnical country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show.
Writing this book is what made me a writer, because before I started it, I was just a reader and a thinker. And now that it's out there in the world, I'm now an author, and it's all thanks to that book.
Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy this show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Mykaela Saunders. They are a Koori and Lebanese writer, teacher and researcher, and the editor of This All Come Back Now, the Aurealis-winning world-first anthology of blackfella speculative fiction published by the University of Queensland Press in 2022. They have won, among other awards, the ABR Elizabeth Jolly Short Story Prize, the Oodgeroo Nunukal Indigenous Poetry Prize, the National Indigenous Story Award, the Grace Marion Wilson Emerging Writers Prize for Creative Nonfiction, and more. We're here today to talk about Mykaela's debut short story collection, Always Will Be, published by University of Queensland Press, which also won the 2022 David Uniapon Award. I started off by asking Mykaela around how she came upon the decision of framing stories around Indigenous futurism, and also how she crafted these stories and put them together. I'm so excited to chat to you about this collection of short stories. We haven't really done a lot of short story collections on Date with a Debut before. And I mean, I've been kind of aware, we were talking about it before we started recording, that I was aware of you from This All Come Back Now, the anthology that you did. And this collection has introduced me to, I'll be completely honest, the amazing space that is Indigenous futurism. And that sort of kind of space that I didn't realize I needed so much in my life, to be 100% honest with you. How did you kind of come across and discover and dive into this world as something that you wanted to write about, even before we get into this book?
Well, we'll have to go back to, say, 2015, 2016, which was, for me, years between doing my master's and my doctorate. So for my master's, which I finished in 2014, I was looking at transgenerational trauma in my community, the Tweed-Guru community, which is where I grew up and I still belong, and which is where my stories are set, as you know. So I was looking at transgenerational trauma, which is, you know, necessarily thinking about the past. It's thinking about history and the effects of policies and other things on our old people, and how those kind of effects come through families and communities and show up in the present day. So that's a really important part of how I came to this. And it doesn't seem like it, but bear with me. Also, in that time, I watched Mad Max Fury Road movie, loved it so much. And I was thinking about how in that movie, and then all of the movies, actually, there's no living Aboriginal characters in those movies. There's one ghost in Fury Road, and he accuses Max in his delirium dream. He says, "You let us die." And that really struck me. It got me thinking about how Aboriginal people are portrayed in the future. And I started feverishly racking my brains for all the Australian futurism I've ever read or watched. And I realized that there's just not a lot of stuff where we are there in the future, and not just like as a lone wolf character or a token black, but as a whole community of characters, which is, you know, how I grew up and how I want to be. I want to be in community, and I want that to be so in the future. So on the one hand, I was thinking about our futures, and I was also thinking about our past and all these policies that actually tried to genocide us from the past. And then I'm thinking about these artistic genocides in the future, and they started to marry up. I wanted to see what had been done, and of course, I'd read Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, but I wasn't really aware of what else was out there. And I actually, shamefully, which is always the case, I started to look at international Indigenous futurisms. I came across a wonderful anthology edited by Grace L. Dillon, who's an Anishinaabe scholar. And she wrote, her anthology is called Walking the Clouds, and it's an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. I also came across Nalo Hopkinson and Upender Meehan's So Long Been Dreaming, which was a post-colonial science fiction and fantasy anthology. And so seeing what other people are doing, I was like, well, why aren't we doing this kind of stuff? And all of that, I guess, kind of coalesced in my mind. I decided I wanted to write my own stories. I wanted to write stories where my community were in the future. We're not just some backdrop or some lone token character, but actually a whole community. And so in 2017, I enrolled in university to do my doctorate. I totally switched fields from education and history into creative writing. And I had to really hustle to get in there because I hadn't written spec fic or published anything before. And happily they let me in. I did a few workshop classes, and the rest is history. And the book that we're talking about today, Always Will Be, that was part of my doctorate thesis, and this is how the book started. And so when you ask me, how did it all start? Well, you have to go back those few years before to what my thinking was. And then, over from 2017 to 2021, that's when I wrote all these stories, and I was really thinking and researching intensely about Indigenous futurisms and also future of my community and sovereignty and all the ideas that are in the book. That's what, that intensive thinking came from.
I love it. I do actually have an additional question I want to poke you about before we actually dive into some of the short stories themselves, because one of the things that obviously as part of this is assembling these stories would be extremely complicated, because did you put, you had that knowledge from the Koori community and how they might reassert sovereignty? Was it a case of that own knowledge in your own mind and fitting the scenarios in each of these short stories? Or did you go back out on country, speak to elders, learn more about the law, and then from that, these stories started to emerge? How did the crafting of this begin?
Well, I can tell you how it began, but that's not how it went the whole way. I actually, every single story in here, so just for listeners, there are 16 stories, and there's one introductory kind of yarn. So there's 16 stories. Each of the stories is set in a different version of the future in the Tweed, and they've all got different climate scenarios, political considerations, all of that. Now, some of these futures are very close, but some are quite far away. But in all of the futures, I'm thinking about how my community would assert their sovereignty in different ways. And that was very important. I was thinking about what the future might look like, how my community would be in these futures. That was, really at the core of it. So a story I wrote was Terra Nora. I wrote it in a workshop class with my wonderful teacher, Fiona McFarlane, who's an incredible writer. And then my second workshop class with Beth Yap, also wonderful writer, beautiful teacher, I wrote River Story. And in those classes, we were just kind of taught the building blocks of fiction craft, starting with place and people, building scenes, dialogue, all that stuff. And so the first two stories from there, and then the training wheels were off. And then, as you say, I was free to think writing stories in all these different ways. And actually, they were all written in different ways. I didn't follow that formula. I was thinking very deeply about sovereignty. And so I was thinking about, how would my community live, for example, if the oceans rose, right? You know which story I'm talking about, cyclone season. Yep. Would my community move off country, or would they just find creative ways to live on the water, right? And as I was thinking about another one, what would happen if the world froze? You know, how would my community live then? And so the result of that is Cold Coast. So there's some questions I started with, but then there were other questions, and that came from actually reading in the genre. So I read all the Aboriginal authors who'd written about the futures, and I was thinking about their questions about the future too, and I try to apply them to my community. Now, you asked, did I go back and did I talk to elders about this stuff? And well, no, because I wasn't doing research. I was like, it was purely my imagination. And I just want to really set down that I'm not speaking for my community here. I'm just speaking as part of my community. And this is just my purely weird imagination, you know. All of the culture stuff that's in here, you know, that just comes from my own experience. But because these stories are set in the future, there's a lot of made up culture here too. I was thinking about, you know, for example, if people were living on the water, what would their culture be? You know, and that's not Aboriginal culture in here and now. It's purely made up.
Love this description, and I also kind of love that you've pretty much nailed the pitch of what the book is about for all of our listeners. On a personal level, we were kind of talking about that a bit beforehand, but this book just came at a great time for me because I've been reading a particular book that I've been drawn to in the last 8 or 9 months was The Dreaming Path by Uncle Paul Gordon and Paul Callahan from the Woromaya Nation, and you know, going through a lot of changes in my own life and I loved what that particular book does in examining, you know, First Nations examination of country, but also being about presence, about meaning, about being alive. And then all of a sudden, Always Will Be comes along. And I love one of the things that really, drew me in about this book was the comparison of First Nations ways, or your lens of examining it, painted with, I'd say Western contexts, or what we've seen that exists prevalently, in how things are today. And that in the world that we find ourselves, sometimes, at least to me, the world that we find ourselves in can feel sometimes bleak, can sometimes feel hopeless. But this book looks at that way of thinking. This way of thinking might be the ideal solution to combat the challenges ahead. This is not a book. This book felt like a celebration to me, filled with solutions and ideas and just a feeling of absolute optimism. I loved it. I mean, put it simply, I loved it. The space that it put out there.
Thank you. Look, it's great that you saw all this hope and optimism in here. I think on the whole, I don't know about optimism. There's some pretty grim stories in here, you know.
There are, yes, there are. But I mean, the space, yes. I mean, one of the stories that we'll get into a little bit was, I mean, I found an intense feeling of optimism around the story around time. One of the very first stories in the book, which we'll kind of delve into a little bit more. And just your examination and recontextualization, for example, of the Western concept of the quote unquote the clock. And how you have for example, the old woman who contains the seasons in her body, and that the solution is to take all the timepieces and throw them away and get rid of them. I found so interesting, and just I found it. I don't know. Maybe it's again my own experience and interpretation from it, from that particular story as an example.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think. I'm going to be really honest. When I was writing and researching and really thinking about these stories and the whole kind of all the research and the thinking that went into it, I went through some really bleak periods of despair thinking about the future, you know. So if we think about the fact that these stories were written from 2017 to 2021, think about those horrible bushfires that we had. We also had the pandemic. There was some really, and there still are some really grim things happening in the world and indeed in our countries. And so these stories were a way of me, you know, exercising my anxieties and my despair. And also thinking about, okay, well, if this is what's happening, how can we be in the future? And so remember how I talked about how I did my thesis on transgenerational trauma in my in my community. Well, see, I actually drew on those stories, and I drew on the whole message of that, which is that our old people already survived their apocalypse, and their apocalypse was so much more world shattering than anything that we can ever imagine. Total change of life, total change of worldview, language, family structures, relationships, everything, spirituality, access to land and resources. So the things that we think are coming to meet us in the future that we think are unfathomable, we actually have a pretty good handle on them. But what happened to, say, my old people and, Aboriginal ancestors in the last few hundred years is actually unfathomable to us. So I drew strength from that, the fact that despite these huge world-shattering changes that our cultures have gone through, we are well equipped to meet whatever wants to meet us in the future, as long as we're together, as long as we have our culture, as long as we have those connections to country. And that's what I hope the book shows, because even though I was grappling with these anxieties and my despair, the underlying reality is that we have survived and we will survive, and whatever happens, we will survive as long as we do it together.
You capture that brilliantly, I think, in the, you mentioned that the all of the short stories, but at the top of the book there is essentially an ode to Bundjalung country, the Tweed, which it's the perfect way to draw you in, and it highlights that resilience brilliantly. That no matter the changes that Gree people face, whether it being forced off the land due to the insane development, the challenges of climate change, the rising sea levels, this is your place. You will find a way to adapt with it, change with it, and build it. I love that opening. It sets the stage brilliantly for the story. But you also, what I loved about it was that you highlighted exactly, there was a resilience that came through, but just highlighted just how intricate that connection is. I loved all of the descriptions of it as that it's kind of like just a big massive bowl. Cyclones come and sweep through the landscape, and that the land is as alive as you and me. And as a framework for all the stories that come afterwards, it's a very beautiful start to the book.
Thank you. Well, it is true. The Western worldview sees land as a commodity to be lived on, and to be fenced up and parceled out and bought and sold. But, blackfellas, we are part of the land, and we don't see a distinction between ourselves and nature, or culture and nature. We are part of the land. We come from the land. We return to the land. The land is a living entity, just as alive as you and me. And this isn't a conceit of fiction and craft that I'm writing this. This is literally what we believe and how we experience the world. And, so it's very important for me to put that front and center of the book, so that before people enter into these stories, enter into these worlds I've created, that they understand that the land isn't just a setting. It's not just a stage set for humans to interact, but actually humans and the different interact with each other. And that's how it is in life too. So it has to be that way in my fiction.
Your stories cover a vast array of different characters and settings and scenarios. We've got, wellness influences, and then the ocean bikies as well, which was like such an interesting scenario. I want to ask a little bit again about this time story. I don't know. Maybe it's just a story that I again connected with very, very quickly. Exactly, you kind of deconstruct in that story. It follows people who don't follow this particular clock again as lazy. You kind of deconstruct how the Western concept of the clock essentially enslaves people to its will. It reminded me of my first real. I remember. Do you remember the film Kanini? The 2006 is a film from 2006.
Uncle Bob Randall, yes.
That's right, from the Junkanjara, yes, nation. And what I loved in that film particularly was that how Uncle Bob. There's a section later in the film where he really talks about how not only are these kind of ways of thinking are not only full of contradictions that don't seemingly make sense, but they also pull us away from what actually connects us, or the land that connects us and creates us. And I love that, again, I think we touched on it a little earlier, but how the response to get the old woman to arise from her slumber is to steal every timepiece, every single clock, and cast it into the mud. I don't know why. Maybe it's the fact that I'm now working a full-time job myself and sometimes feel enslaved to that clock. I just felt very touched by that story and by that re-examination of how time is.
Yeah, well, it is. Time is very cultural. Name anything, any concept or philosophy or way of doing or being, they're all cultural. And I guess it's if you come from a culture where everything that you do and think and believe is taken as the norm, then you take it for granted. You see it as all as invisible. And what I wanted to do with that story is to expose the fact that these ways of living through a calendar, through a clock, timing ourselves and timing the stages of our lives, this is a cultural thing, and we shouldn't take it for granted. We should absolutely interrogate it. It's not the natural way. It's not the only way. It's certainly not the best way. It's a very new way. If you think about how long people have been living on this continent, it is absolutely a small blip of time that people have been using clocks and calendars to live and to structure their lives. And it causes so much stress for people and for the land. It causes so much stress for relationships. It causes stress for elders, for young people. It causes stress for animals. It causes stress for pretty much everyone except for those people who are making money off us and our labor. And so I wanted to think about this and interrogate it. I wanted to imagine, oh my God, what would happen if we did away with all this stuff? How could we live again? We could live seasonally. We could live cyclically. This is how our old people lived. And indeed, any land-based culture, any Indigenous culture knows that this is the right way to live with the land rather than to try and subjugate it, using these man-made instruments of tyranny. So, yeah, this story, as with all the stories, really, they are, as I mentioned, they're me kind of exercising my demons. They're thinking through my anxieties and my grief, but they're also wish fulfillment too, a lot of the stories. I'm thinking, oh, what if we did this? How could this happen? Now, of course, it's very metaphorical and metaphysical, this story. I don't believe that if we just got rid of clocks that all this would happen, because capitalism will find other ways. But I think as a metaphor, as a symbol, the clock is a very powerful one. It's something we can all relate to. As you said, you're working full time and you're very conscious of your time and how much of it's spent and taken up and eaten by this clock. And yeah, I just wanted to think about, how could we live without it?
I really wish I could, a podcast is a limited time and I wish I could delve into every single story but just the examinations of, I love that you mentioned kind of the wish fulfillment, because that definitely comes through in these stories, because again, I was kind of driven, an imagination of what could be was kind of, even if it is, the concepts and ideas are, might be far flung in the future and involve all sorts of things that we haven't even come close to fully understanding. Yet there it is still a what if scenario of with around that framework. Seeing as it was kind of a demon's exercising, well, it's a sort of exercise for you. I'm always curious what crafting these stories teaches you. What did it teach you that you didn't know beforehand when you started these stories?
Well, how to write a short story, for one. How to write stuff. I'd never written speculative fiction before, and I'd never written short stories before. I mean, I might have, back in school, but I wasn't a writer before this, now I am. I became a writer through writing this book. So writing these stories taught me how to write stories. And each story taught me how to write itself in its own way. I was experimenting with voice, point of view, structure, shape of story, all the things that I find really fun to play around with. I was thinking about characters as embodiments of problems or opportunities that each world could present. I was thinking about world building. I was thinking about all the things that you need to think about with speculative fiction for the very first time in my life, mind you. I'm a lifelong consumer, reader, watcher of speculative fiction genres, but creating your own, you have to kind of peel back the curtain and you have to look at the mechanics of how these things are made and produced. And so for the first time in my life, when I was reading like a writer, not like a reader. I was reading or rereading my favorite books and thinking about what that writer was doing to produce this effect or to create this scene or whatever. And that's what you have to do when you want to be an artist of whatever description, is you have to study the art that you love, and you have to, even the art that you hate, and you have to figure out what it is about these particular examples that you love, that you hate, and how can you learn from it. And so it was such a steep and lovely learning curve. I mentioned that I wrote 2 of the stories in a workshop classes, but the rest I wrote by myself. And in fact, some of the stories in here, the first drafts of them were so bad. But I'm not someone who will write a story by perfecting a sentence and then a paragraph and then building. I just write the absolute worst draft I can possibly get, because I guess a lot of the time the story comes to me, well, not fully formed, but there's something there. There's something I need to, really figure out, and I just get it down as quickly as possible. And then a story can go through so many iterations. It'll usually change, the voice or the point of view or the structure in those later drafts. And of course, at the sentence level, making it more beautiful, more polished, because, every sentence matters, and every sentence has to do the job of carrying the story forward. Otherwise, the reader won't want to. Yeah, so very long-winded way of saying, writing this book is what made me a writer, because before I started it, I was just a reader and a thinker. And now that it's out there in the world, I'm now an author, and it's all thanks to that book.
Great that University of Queensland Press is out there, is helping you support this book. Of course, you did This All Come Back Now, kind of that anthology. And what was it like with, assembling a short story collection, making it flow, work together, have stories that stand out on their own but complement one another? It would be, I've never attempted that. That's a whole other art form, and I think short story writing is as difficult, if not more, than writing an actual full-length novel, because brevity can sometimes be a significant challenge. What was it like crafting that particular story with UQP, and what was it like also kind of going back and forth with this kind of your own headspace around kicking around with these stories, and also ensuring that those those ideas that you kind of had at the crux of each story was also fulfilled and pushed through?
Well, when UQP came to the manuscript for editing, I had already done so much work on it. So the manuscript, for context, won the 2022 David Unaipon Award, and part of the prize is publication with UQP. Now, when I was very happily told that I won that award, I was, obviously thrilled beyond belief, but I had a few anxieties about the manuscript still. I'm a perfectionist. I don't really like people reading my stuff until I'm really happy with it. And of course, you're happy with it until you read your stuff a few months later, and then you realize, oh, it still needs work. So I asked UQP if I could have a bit more extra time just to sit with it and think about it, because I actually, there were stories that were in the original manuscript that didn't make the final cut because they didn't quite work. And as you said, I had to think about how the stories were structured. I think editing the anthology, This All Come Back Now, taught me, what thoughtful curation can do, with the sequencing and structure of stories. And I certainly was very thoughtful about it in the anthology. I wanted those stories to tell a bigger story. And I brought that attitude to my own book, Always Will Be. I wanted the stories to suggest, a larger story. But as you said, they can also stand alone. And indeed, a lot of these stories were published in different, anthologies or literary journals before being part of this collection. But to my mind, they've always been part of this world. And the way that I sequenced and structured them for Always Will Be was I tried to suggest a kind of a chronological time. I tried to begin the stories with the most near future that I could probably think about. And then they start getting a little bit more outlandish, a little bit further away in time. And then, some of the stories are set quite far in the future. But I wanted the reader to get that satisfaction of thinking about them as, part of the same world or the same universe or timeline, but also, enjoying each of the stories as its own entity, as its own world.
I picked up on that a little bit. I'm not going to lie. It flowed very beautifully. It did feel like the same world, but how the actual stories came together as it built up over the course of the book, it was lovely. I mean, when I say lovely, and just pure craftsmanship of the actual how you put them all together. On that topic, I know that you said that there were a few stories that didn't make the cut. Mm-hmm. Will you write again? Will there be more?
No, I think this project is done. I think each book and each project, it brings up its own questions and things that you need to think about and work. And I think I can leave this one to rest now. Maybe, years down the track, I might think about futures again. But for this particular project, this is done. I've got other things I want to write. I'm very interested in all kinds of different genres. I don't want to just write futuristic stuff. I want to write, I've been writing a few kind of gothic short stories, horror. I'm working on a novel. Well, when I get time. I've been working on this novel for a while, but I have a nonfiction and poetry project that I've half drafted. I'm very interested in all the different forms and genres, and I want to have a go at all of them. And I don't want to be a one-trick pony and just kind of write the same thing, the same stuff that people expect of me. I'm not interested in that. I've certainly felt that pressure, but I want to resist that. I want to write for myself. I want to write for the things that give me pleasure, and then I hope that translates to good writing that a reader will enjoy.
Well, whatever you do, I'm super excited about it. And I think the fact that you've, even with this Will Come Back Now and with Always Will Be, you've picked up on something that is, I think, is a space that we should all pay a lot more attention to, whether it be, and I hope that there are other writers out there who look at this thing and be inspired to pick it up and examine their own stories in such a way. You should be really proud of it.
Thank you. Well, for me, I really hope people will think about, and especially, for me, my ideal audience are Aboriginal readers, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander readers and writers. I'm a community person, and I write for the people in my community and who live in their own communities. I want them to think about their own communities in the future and themselves and their families. I want them to think about themselves thriving in whatever future. I want, just as I was inspired to write my own speculative fiction short stories by reading anthologies, I hope it inspires others to write their own as well and to think about these questions, because even though my stories are set in a very particular place, the Tweed, only, purely because I grew up there and I know it the best, I think a lot of the issues that come up in my stories, are actually issues that a lot of blackfellas are going to face, and indeed a lot of other people are going to face, when it comes to climate, and social structures and fascism and all those kinds of things. I was certainly inspired to write, by reading Alexis Wright. Many years ago, I read her and I thought, wow, what a voice. I would love to write something like that one day. And it took me a few years, but I did get there. But, I think that's what the best book should do. It should inspire other people to, pick that baton up and to carry on with that conversation and to, create and to also, contribute something to the world and to our collective creative consciousness.
We're at the part of the podcast where I like to, hit you with some rapid fire questions. And normally we kick this off by talking about your favorite books that you've been reading and things like that. But considering you have been really down, you've explored a lot of Indigenous speculative fiction over the last little while. I really want to poke you about that. What's some of your favorite Indigenous speculative fiction that you have enjoyed? And do you have any recommendations for someone who wants to dive into that genre a bit more?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'll start with the last question. So if you're looking for Indigenous speculative fiction, you would do well to read the anthology I edited called This All Come Back Now, because it's an anthology of First Nations speculative fiction. There's futurism, there's horror, there's ghost stories, there's science fiction, climate fiction, all of it in there. And it's it's the only anthology of blackfella speculative fiction. And what I did in this anthology is I collected brand new stories that had never been published from authors who'd never published before to the classics of the genre. We put extracts of novels in there, and I hope that readers can read this anthology and see the kind of breadth and depth of our thinking in this genre. So, which leads me to the first question you asked, who are the classics? Well, some of my favorites are in this anthology. Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, which was published in 2013. It's set a few hundred years into the future. It's a very grim, sad, dystopian climate fiction novel, but it's also very beautiful, and there's a lot of important stuff in there when we're thinking about the future of our communities and cultures and countries. The first ever Aboriginal speculative fiction novel was published in 1990, and that was written by Mununjali author and activist Sam Watson, who's passed away now. But the Kadaitcha Sung, we've also got an extract in this anthology. It's a very, very weird story, and critics at the time didn't really know how to read it. Indeed, still today, people are a bit like, what do we do with this book? But it's a story that combines, fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, all kinds of genres are mishmashed up into this thing, and it's just a really interesting story, and it's the first, so people should always start there. Yeah. And one more I'll mention is Archie Weller's science fiction fantasy novel, Land of the Golden Clouds. There's an extract in this anthology as well. That was written in 1998, and Archie Weller is a wonderful Noongar writer. He's mostly known for his more realist stuff, but he is a huge sci-fi fan and loves writing it, as he told me when we used to speak around this anthology. So yeah, so they're my favorites. There's, you know, all the stories in this anthology are my favorite, but they're the classics, so readers should start there, I think.
Oh, great. I really want to keep poking you. Like, I need more. I want to know more. I need to explore this. Given this podcast also covers debuts and debut stories, do you have a favorite debut novel that you've ever read? I'm talking ever.
It's not a novel. It's mostly short stories with one novella, and it's
Perfect.
Heat and Light by Ellen Van Neerven. And the first part of the book is kind of set in the here and now, but the middle part of it is a novella called Water. And there's an extract of that in This All Come Back Now. And I read it years ago, and I thought it was so brilliant and beautiful and weird. You know, in it, the Aboriginal protagonist has this beautiful, strange love affair with a not human plant person. It reminded me of Jeanette Winterson stuff, you know, the Stone Gods, but it's set, you know, on the islands out in the bays in Brisbane. So it's a very local kind of story. And Ellen was very young when they wrote this, and it also won the David Unaipon Award in 2014, I think. And just incredible storytelling, incredibly vivid and mature writing for someone so young. And of course, they've gone on to write incredible stuff in all genres, but that was a debut that I think is really beautiful, and it's something that I will always be in awe of for Ellen writing that when they was such a young writer.
Do you have you spoke again, as mentioned in Always Will Be? All of these stories are set in the Tweed, and you have such a love for that country, for that place, for that space. Yeah. Is there a favorite place that you like to go to in the Tweed?
Anywhere on the water, which is, you know, it's not hard. Tweed, you throw a stone and you're at the water wherever you are, because it's, you know, you've got the ocean on one side and you've got all the rivers and the estuaries. I spent a lot of my time growing up, and every time I go back, you know, at the beach, on the rivers, fishing, on the boats, paddleboarding, surf a little bit when I was younger, you know, all that kind of stuff. I just anywhere you go, but it's a place that's changed a lot in the last few years. You know, there's a housing crisis, as there is everywhere. In fact, one of my stories touches on that. And when I wrote the story, it was the future, but it's not the future anymore. That's happening now. You know, there's hardly any long-term rentals. It's mostly all Airbnbs. It's pushed the prices up. It's pushed locals out. There's new developments going up every week. It's very sad, you know, but that's happening everywhere. But yeah, so when I talk about a favorite place, I'm talking about the water, but I'm also probably being a little bit nostalgic and thinking about the past, because we all kind of think back to our days growing up somewhere, and we have rose-colored glasses. And yeah, so when I think about the Tweed in its perfect iteration, it is, you know, when I grew up, and I have all these beautiful memories that made me who I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true, and it is, as alluded to, it's a changing space. It's a changing place, and yeah, I will say that the particular story about the housing crisis, it did leave an impression. It really did. Particularly, in my headspace, kind of that generation that is even looking for that place and that space, and just that feeling that it gives you is, was just telling, but then also just the other context that you kind of have also weaved through the book as well.
Yeah.
In crafting the book, it's a question I always like to ask a lot of authors. Do you have a favorite word, a particular word?
Well, the guiding word for this collection was sovereignty, guru sovereignty. What does a sovereign guru community look like in any given future, or any given version of the present or even the past, that was always the guiding word. And sovereignty can mean a lot of things. And I'm not just talking in the legal sense, although that's certainly true, but I'm talking about spiritual sovereignty, relational sovereignty, sovereignty when it comes to, even just thinking about relationships to land and to each other, to community, to ceremonies over birth and death. Every single story is grappling with sovereignty in some form or another. And in the stories where sovereignty has been eroded, the characters are indeed thinking about it. They're thinking about cultural sovereignty. And in the stories where it's, a lot more fully reasserted, I'm thinking about, well, what are some of the issues that might come up with that? So, yeah, sovereignty is the word.
Perfect choice. As a last question, are you happy?
With my book?
In general. Could be. I mean, the book's amazing.
Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm not. I think I'm a pretty cheerful person, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm happy all the time. I'm very dissatisfied with the world. I'm very dissatisfied with lots of things in the world, particularly how our people are treated. I'm absolutely devastated with what's happening to Palestinian people by the state of Israel. That's particularly at the forefront of my mind. None of that makes me happy, but the things that do make me happy are, community, family, friends, creativity, the strength of my colleagues and people that I love and admire, who are standing up for what's right and who are making the world a better place. So, I don't know about happy, but I just like my book. I don't think they're happy stories, but there is happiness in the stories that aren't happy.
Yeah, I think that's that was kind of the answer I was going to expect, because there is so much in there and so much to examine. Mykaela, thank you so much for joining us today, and I cannot wait to see what where your writing and your desire for writing takes you next.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for such beautiful questions and for your time. And I hope the readers enjoy the book and keep supporting your show.
I certainly hope so as well. And yes, everyone listening, get Always Will Be. It's extremely recommended. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you soon.